Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Center for Civil and Human Rights for this week's program, Women Fighting for the Right to Vote. We are very excited to have you with us. And just as a little piece of housekeeping, all comments of the moderators and guests of our programs represent the thoughts of each individual and do not necessarily represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. We've got a great panel for you today, and we also have a wonderful moderator today. Hilary Holly joins us from Fair Fight, where she has been working on bringing out the vote in Georgia, as well as across a number of other states. So, Hilary, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Cameron. I'm just so incredibly excited to be here this afternoon with these amazing women, these amazing Black women who inspire me every single day. I want to take a time to just go around, and I would love for each one of you to not only introduce yourselves, but really what inspires you, what brings you to this work, because it's incredibly hard work, especially in times like these where we are seeing a lot of regressive movements happening specifically in voting rights. So who are you, but what inspires you to do this work? And I'm going to start with my queen and and she already knows who I'm talking about, Miss Helen Butler.
Hi, Hilary, and thank you for the National Center for Civil and Human Rights for hosting this, and I'm happy to be here with the other great panelists. What really inspired me about this work is being able to connect with my people of color, especially the African American, African diaspora, and the Caribbean communities for which we target. But the People's Agenda, to which I serve as executive director, was formed by Dr. Joseph Lowery and so many civil rights leaders whose primary mission was to really get people engaged in public policy work, knowing that public policy impacts every part of our lives, and that in order to have great representatives, it always starts with us through our vote. And so that's what has inspired me. I was brought to this work by my brother with the NAACP Voter Fund. I met Dr. Lowery and Reverend Orange, and it's history after that. I've been with them since 2003 and have been doing this work throughout the state. We have 7 offices across the state that we do work that are led by primarily women, Black women. Of course, we have a couple of men that work for us, but it's primarily Black women that are working in the communities to make changes. And I'll stop there.
Tamika Atkins, would you introduce yourself and let everyone know what brings you to this work? What inspires you?
Thanks, Hilary. My name is Tamika Atkins. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the executive director of ProGeorgia. That means I have the honor of coordinating voter registration and civic engagement efforts of over 40 different powerful, leaderful, state-based organizations in Georgia. And I'm always happy and proud to say that Ms. Helen Butler is one of our founding board members, and the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda was one of our founding organizations when we were 13 organizations strong instead of 40. And I began this work, as a community organizer more than 20 years ago. I grew up in South Jamaica, Queens, in a community that was extremely over-policed. I did not know that it was not normal to have police checks on Friday evenings where they shine the light in your car and in the trunk of your car. Until I was probably 19 or 20 when I started college. And during my freshman year of college, that is when Amadou Diallo was murdered by the police. He was shot 41 times, pulling his wallet out. And for me, that was a pivotal moment in my life, because that's really what jump-started my activism and my organizing. And so I did a lot of community organizing work with Student Liberation Action Movement up in New York. Eventually started working on larger human rights issues with Amnesty International, which then actually brought me to Georgia. And what really jump-started my civic engagement work, because I always tell people before this job, I think I was an hourly employee with NYPIRG, knocking on doors for $10 and $11 an hour, right? That was my main introduction and involvement with civic engagement. But when I came down to Georgia and I had the honor of being the founding director of the Atlanta chapter of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, working with nannies, housekeepers, and home care workers, primarily of the African diaspora here in Atlanta and Georgia overall, we found that the main issue for domestic workers here was a lack of health care and health insurance. And so that started us on a fight for expanding Medicaid. And when the state of Georgia decided, our governor at the time decided to give up the power to implement Medicaid expansion single-handedly and make it a decision of the entire legislature, that really started to pump up a lot of domestic workers in Georgia to get engaged in voter registration and civic engagement. And that's just been my trajectory since then. We joined the table as a partner. And then 2 or 3 years later, I came on as the deputy director. And now I have, again, the honor to bring my community organizing skills, my community organizing skills, my leadership development skills to now the civic engagement sphere, and work and be in partnership with some fantastic leaders that have been doing this work for decades here in state.
And last but not least, Dr. Vicki Crawford, would you introduce yourself and tell us what inspires you and brings you to this work?
Well, thank you, Hilary. I'm just so pleased to be here with these absolutely outstanding organizers. I'm an academic, and my background is in American Studies with a focus on African American history, 20th century history. I am a historian of the Civil Rights Movement. And when I was a graduate student in the 80s, I got very drawn to the study of the movement and women's roles and contributions to the Black freedom struggle. That was absent from the pages of history in the 1980s. Now, since that time, we've had many publications that have come out, books and all sorts of materials and film, wonderful documentary film. But at that time, women's contributions, women's roles, they were absent from history, or if they were mentioned, they were marginalized. So I've been on this path of documenting African-American women's participation in political movement, social justice movements since, oh my gosh, 30 years ago. And back in 1988, I was very fortunate to be a part of a unique conference that brought together both scholars, academics, as well as activists, women scholars and activists here in Atlanta. It was sponsored by the King Center and Georgia State University. And out of that conference came a book, Women in the Civil Rights Movement, Trailblazers and Torchbearers, which really documents some of the unsung heroines of the movement. And they were there, by the way. I mean, it was just a stellar list of folk who were very active in Alabama, all throughout the South. Names that, many have passed on. Unita Blackwell, Annie Devine, Victoria Gray, just all sorts of women. So that's what draws me to this. And I'm very inspired by the work that's being done by Tamieka and Miss Helen. And so just great to be here to sort of put a historical frame around things. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm actually gonna start with you, because I think we are currently sitting in a very interesting moment in American history and American Black history. And so I'm just curious to help frame this conversation, and before we go into the nitty-gritty, how do you see right now just what is happening when it comes to voting rights in the movement work? Is there any differences that you are noticing in today's age and the fights that are going on today that seem connected or very similar to what the Black struggle has looked like in American history?
Well, the Black struggle has been a long struggle. And as historian Vincent Harding talks about in his book, There is a River, there is a continuation of this. And we see that today. And when we look at the roles of African-American women fighting for voting rights, this goes back to over 2 centuries, really, over 2 centuries, with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. And Black women worked hard for the passage of the 19th Amendment. They were attending meetings, they were involved in suffrage marches. They put it all in for that. And then after passage of the amendment, they did not get the right to vote. Alongside Black men, Black women were disenfranchised after having done all that work. So we find that at that point, that moment in history, they were disenfranchised, subjected to all sorts of methods of being unable to vote, poll taxes, them literacy tests. And here we are today, we look back and then we look at where we are now, and you've got some of the old school ways of disenfranchising folks that are that's going on. And now we've got some new methods of doing it. So, you look back, you look at where we are, you look forward, there's a lot of work to be done. There's this continuity in this history. And, that's what really draws me to it, that we need to know it. That we need to have this long memory as we think about innovative and new ways to approach it.
Got it. So, Ms. Helen, let's start talking about what exactly is happening right now. So, in the year of 2022, where we have many very important elections up and down the ballot in Georgia, what are some of the current challenges that you and your team at People's Agenda are working on? And what are some of the biggest concerns that you see voters facing this year as they go to vote?
Well, as Dr. Crawford said, it's just as it was in past history with the poll tax and all those other literacy tests. Though we don't have those, but we do have barriers that are put in place. Poll tax is a photo ID to get an absentee ballot. That's a poll tax, because if you don't have the documentation to prove who you are, you got to go get it. You have to pay for it. To get the ID, you have to pay for it. Now they're requiring an ID just to request an absentee ballot in this pandemic that we experienced in 2020 and 2021, even though we had historic turnout numbers, because people stood in line and they understood that it was very important to get the right people elected. Absentee voting was one of the great ways that they could do that, through the use of drop boxes. They've done away with drop boxes, basically. Even though they say they're still available, they are practically useless from what their intention was for a drop box. But the most egregious part to me is the takeover process that was used in search of a lie. The lie that, I just need 11,000 more votes, or that, there's fraud in elections and we got to have this Election Integrity Act, as it's called now, SB 202. But that was primarily a barrier that was put in place. But it takes election process total control that could really change the outcome, because it says that the state legislature, which is a partisan assembly, because you got Republicans and Democrats and they both do it, but it's the thing of that they have the ability to appoint a person who has no qualifications for running an election. They could take over the entire process. So that means they could determine who registered to vote, when they registered to vote, how they registered to vote, what days they are able to register to vote, whether that vote gets counted, whether the election in essence gets certified. And so that takeover provision to me is most troubling. They've criminalized a lot of activities. Even giving water can be a criminal activity if you not do it properly. So it's those kinds of things that are still barriers that are in place. So the most challenging thing is for us to know, because they changed the rules for when you can request an absentee ballot, what's the last day you can. There's 2 mandatory Saturdays now. That was the good part. But the other part of it, the unlimited challenges, not being able to vote out of precinct before 5 p.m. and not having your vote counted. So those are things that we really need to be aware of. So to me, we have to do more education about the process to make sure people know how to legitimately exercise their right to vote and have it counted and not get there. Luckily, so far, they haven't done anything to the voter registration process, which we all do, and we're doing right now. But I mean, we have until sine die, which is the last day of the legislative session. So I'm not saying that too loudly. But the idea is that even with the redistricting process, they changed lines. So you got to know who now represents you and where your district lines are. So again, it's a ball of confusion that is designed not to provide integrity, but designed to prevent a certain number of people from being able to exercise their right to vote.
Thank you, Ms. Helen. And so Tamieka, thinking ProGeorgia, you know, it represents so many organizations in Georgia who aren't necessarily solely focused on voting rights, right? Can you talk a little bit about the interconnections with voting rights and other social justice issues, and how ProGeorgia has had to look at voting rights in a way to help support the organizations that are focused on other social justice issues?
Thanks, Hilary. So, you know, I love how you started that. Like, there's just many of our organizations, many of our partners are not solely or specifically voting rights organizations, right? So we have partners who are focusing on LGBTQ advocacy, some that are focused on economic justice, housing issues, reproductive justice, environmental justice. The list goes on and on. And, you know, the main takeaway why everyone comes to the table is that all of these organizations have agreed, they believe that if they're going to build long-term and sustainable power for their communities, which is really a shared and overlap community, right? That voting and the act of voting and the civic engagement and the education around voting has to be a part of their overall work, their overall mission and vision. And so that's where the table comes in. We make it as easy as possible for our organizations, our partners, to still lift up their particular communities, their specific social justice areas, and include voter registration and voter education in their overall work. Ms. Helen mentioned that we've already started voter registration. And so that means that for some of our partner organizations, when they're holding community events, if they're doing leadership development trainings, for some of our partners that work with the New American community, if they're doing English as a second language or preparing people for applying for citizenship, part of the conversation is voter education, voter information, who are your elected officials, how do you access the ballot? And it means we are tying the needed services to voting and voter registration. None of our partners show up in their own community once a year. These are not transactional relationships. That means that partners and organizations are there during the legislative session and keeping their community informed and engaged. They're there throughout the spring and summer to help with voter registration. And then they're in the fall to help our folks turn out to vote and connect their act of voting to the issues that matter to them. Because people vote because of their lives and what's happening in their lives. And at the table, we provide a lot of tools and resources to make this function as smoothly as possible. We provide a lot of data and a lot of data related tools. So as for myself, when I was a community organizer, we'd go knocking door to door to build a list of people that we can call for activities and events and actions later on in the year. But using a lot of the tools that are provided to us, our partners are able to create a list larger than just the immediate people they talk to reach out to about an issue related to reproductive justice, right? That means if one of our partners, so now they can reach, instead of 500 people, possibly 5,000 people. Because again, it's the communication and the contact that matters, right? It also means that our partners who may focus on environmental justice in the public service commissioner race, right? They're able to amplify the importance of voting down ballot and the importance of the PSC race with other organizations that focus on healthcare, that focus on LGBTQ advocacy. So again, it's this amplification when it's not just one or 5 organizations advocating and doing the voter education, but when there's that overlap and all 40 partners are able to amplify a shared message. And, I think this is a part of, how we work and how we work in the South. It's about the relationships, right? Because our partners, they coordinate the voter registration and civic engagement through the table, but these are relationships that are fostered, that live down at the legislative session, that live when they're out there doing election protection. These are real tangible relationships that are then also, witnessed and felt by the community. So, it's all about these electoral outcomes, but it has to be based on the relationship, the partnership, the education, and tying the issues that matter to the act of voting.
And so, thank you for that. A lot of, there was a lot of, in 2020, many people framed that election as, this is the election of our lifetime. And in many ways it was. But thinking about what you were just saying, Tamieka, and for those watching right now who may not know, we are seeing so many attacks in our legislature right now on almost every single issue. We're seeing attacks on public education. They passed a bill yesterday that can help streamline book banning. We are seeing a bill just pass out of committee a couple hours ago that could actually make increase cash bail and actually make it even harder to get out of jail before you're even on trial or have been charged with a crime. We're also seeing them trying to roll back on elections and so many other issues. So I think and Dr. Crawford, I'm not going to forget you, but I want to go back to Ms. Helen, thinking about the 2022 elections and what we're seeing happening in the legislature, and thinking of what Tamieka just said, how it's all interconnected. What are your thoughts, and how do you plan on approaching 2022 elections, where we have statewide elections all the way from the governor, secretary of state, the school board superintendent, labor commissioner, because we know that there's been so many labor concerns under COVID. What are your thoughts on how to approach the 2022 elections, and then also thinking about the different barriers? So what are your thoughts on how to approach this year? What's your plan, Ms. Helen?
My plan is we've got to amplify what we did in 2020 and 2021, meaning we've got to have turnout. So to get the turnout at the levels that we had there and above, I want an 80% turnout rate. I may be over ambitious, but that's what I want to shoot for. But the thing is, we've got to do a lot of educate. Well, we're going to register people. We've already started that, but we've got to do a lot of education. We are doing a green book, and I didn't publish it during the municipal election because I knew coming up would be the legislative session in January, and with the changes, like for now, they're proposing the GBI to be a part of the investigation of election fraud, which is nothing but voter intimidation and has no real bearing because the Secretary of State already and the district attorney general have the power to investigate election fraud. And they have done so in the past and continue to do it right now. So the GBI is just another form of intimidation. But we've got to educate everyone about all of the changes that are happening. We've got to provide, first of all, the maps to everyone. Here are the maps for Congress. Here are the maps for the state Senate, the state House. Here are the maps for your Board of Commissioners, your Board of Education, your Public Service Commission. So people now know the lines and who potentially might be their representative. We've got to start with my voter page. You've got to always check that to know where you're voting, who you're voting for, and when you're voting. We've got to have billboards, everything that we can to identify every election. We have an election nearly every month. We just had one in March, right? A special election. We have other special elections coming up, in addition to the primary that's coming up on March the 24th. So we've got to educate. We've got to educate about who can provide an absentee ballot, when you can provide that absentee ballot. What's the last day that person, 11 days before election day, you can get an absentee ballot. We've got to tell people how to get those IDs if they don't have the IDs. Well, first they got to know which IDs they need and how do I get those IDs. We've got to know where the driver services are to get free IDs in addition to my local boards of election offices, or I can get Georgia IDs at driver services. So we've got to know that. We've got to be able to mobilize people. We've got to provide rides to the polls. And thankfully, during the pandemic, we usually work with churches, faith-based groups, to provide their vans and drivers for rides to the polls. Well, in a pandemic, we had to use Lyft codes. And I had young people that actually would schedule for old people who, like me, don't know how to use Lyft, but schedule it for them. Once they got voted, we'd schedule a ride back for them home. So it's things like that outside of the box we've got to think of. How do we get people to go beyond those barriers? If there are long lines, and we're hoping there aren't going to be long lines like there was in 2020. We're going to do poll worker recruitment. We need young people to be actually poll workers, to really know how to operate those iPads that you check in on and how to fix them if something goes wrong, because we old people don't know how to fix them. And it's things like that. We've got to make sure we're involved in every aspect. We ask everybody to join our democracy squad, where we're monitoring boards of election meetings so that we can find out, like in Lincoln County, we just stopped a consolidation of 7 polling locations into one, but that was because we were monitoring boards of elections to be able to do that. So those are things like that that we have to do. We have to have election protection monitors that we will train as a part of the ProGeorgia table. I had the election administration and election protection work group. So we need poll monitors, right? Where we can train you to go be able to assist. And we're taking into account what will happen with regards from a security perspective as well. So we've got to have people that monitor disinformation. We've got to be out there telling people what is the correct information. You need the trusted messengers like Jeanette, like Linda in Athens, who work there every day to be able to tell them, no, this is not the right information. So we've got to be doing these things to make sure people, A, register, know how to vote, know who to vote for. We don't tell them who to vote for, but we sure tell them how to get information about those candidates. And every Tuesday we have candidate forums, so they can join in on that. But again, that is what we got to do, everything we can to ensure that people are able to exercise their right to vote without barriers.
So that's a lot,
Well,
right?
and also I want to say, if people need copies of their ID, because you have to provide the copy with your absentee ballot, we're going to have printers and generators so that if we don't have electricity, our machines will still work. So the churches can actually have their congregants come in and make copies of their IDs. We can work with Office Depot to say, have a day of copying your voter IDs so that people can have those for all of the elections that they will vote for. So it's things like that that we have to think about that will help people to be able to vote. And if they're standing in line, we're going to have snacks and water beyond 150 feet. But again, we want people to be able to exercise their right to vote.
Yeah. I remember after SB 202 passed and we learned about the photocopy of an ID, and someone made a joke to me. They're like, oh, Hillary's about to go and ask us to buy 2,000 printers and have printer stations across the state. And I was like, I hadn't gotten there yet, but now that you say it, can you go ahead and work up a budget so I can get it submitted? Because that's the type of work it's going to take. And so thinking about everything Ms. Helen said, that can be a lot, right? And after COVID and an economic crisis, and that we're seeing international crises happening, it can be overbearing. So I'm wondering, Dr. Crawford, if you can help contextualize this, as there's so much, things are hard and people are tired and there's a lot of pain. But so I'm wondering if you can help contextualize the fact that yes, there's so much work to do, but in reality, this is work that we've always had to do. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if there's any advice that you can give to people who are hearing everything that Ms. Helen's saying we need to do, so they don't lose hope and they know that we can get this work done.
So we can't lose hope. And, resistance has been a part of our history, and we continue to resist. And I get hope when I study history, and I think of people like Miss Amelia Boynton Robinson down in Selma. Miss Robinson died recently at the age of 104, I believe. And she, for all of her adult life, was working. I mean, this is lifelong work. I don't think we expect to see, there's a long game here, and we understand that. And so that's why it's important that we nurture ourselves, that we have joy, because this is a long distance race, and we know that. But I think of Miss Amelia Boynton Robinson beaten at Selma, the Selma March with Congressman John Lewis. She worked for all of her adult life, again, registering voters, co-founder of the Dallas County in Alabama, Dallas County Voters League, doing all of this kind of work. Look at Fannie Lou Hamer, sharecropper in Mississippi. When I read these stories and I hear these histories, I'm just reminded of the fight. And how we have to stay in the struggle. Mrs. Hamer went down to register to vote in 1962, went back to, it was a plantation where she was living as a sharecropper. And plantation owner put her and the family, threw them off the plantation. She didn't have a place, she didn't have work. But Ms. Hamer became very involved in the movement, working across generations with younger people. That's another thread that I see that gives me inspiration, that this is a multi-generational effort. And I'm just listening to everything that Helen said that's needed. And so we really have to energize young people and college students and 20-year-olds to help us do this work and enlist their support and get them on board. So the history tells me that we can't lose hope, that this is a long distance race, that we're in it for a lifetime, and we've got to be educated. That's another thread that, thing that sticks out to me. We've got to be educated and commit to that. So
thank you so much. And so let's start talking about how to get people involved. So Tamieka, if with all the folks that are listening, and being like, okay, Miss Helen done told us there's over 25 things that we need to do. How can how can people get involved in this moment right now?
Well, I think the way people can get involved in this moment right now, I'd recommend that they check out our website, GoVoteGA.org. That is a hub for many of our partners, including Ms. Helen. And so when we are looking for poll workers to train poll workers, when we are looking for disinformation monitors, when we are looking for election protection monitors, a lot of those opportunities are posted there. It's also a great way to get in touch with all 40 organizations. Again, for many of our partners, there's a lot of opportunities when it comes to the poll monitoring, poll watching, volunteering to be a poll worker, and also coming down to the state capitol, being a part of a lobby day on the issue that matters to you most. Because I think, you know, that when you vote in election day, that's actually the first step of many, many, many steps of a lifelong, you know, being civically involved and engaged in our democracy. And so I recommend that folks check out our website so that they can connect to as many of our partners as possible and get plugged into these opportunities. I do also want to say, Hilary, to the point you mentioned about, and Ms. Helen, about lifting up youth. At this point, I think about 22%, so 1 in every 5 Georgian that's eligible to vote is under the age of 30. And so that means, and then when you couple this in with the pandemic over the last 2 years, I think all of us in Georgia, the progressive infrastructure, I think we definitely rose to the challenge and met it, and pivoting what it has been primarily in-person conversations and in-person voter registration to an online mechanism. We definitely, you know, it was, I remember QR codes were hot back in the day, and then they weren't hot anymore. And then, you know, as a part of like, how do we reach our folks? How do we meet our folks and meet young people where they're at? You know, people dusted off those QR codes, and, you know, it became a easy way to communicate, I think, a lot of the information that Ms. Helen's been sharing by scanning a QR code. And so that means that all 40 partners, all websites, all the materials have QR codes that are so easy to one and done scan and get the information you need so that you can better access your ballot and participate in our democracy. Like, how do you overcome some of the hurdles and barriers that are put into place? That information is there through the QR codes. I will say one other thing about connecting with young folks. We collectively launched our Stay Woke Vote campaign. And again, back to us being a table that coordinates voter rights and civic engagement, we focus on like the holistic, the entirety of our organization. So I think to Dr. Crawford's point about centering joy, that this is a long game. This is not an overnight project or overnight commitment. And so what that meant is that, you know, when we look at 2020, some of our efforts included, you know, providing childcare grants to our partners, right? Because we understand that so many of our leaders at the table are women of color. More than 2/3 of our table partners, table organizations are led by women and women of color. And so we already know that they're wearing multiple hats and that they live and work at the intersections. And so we provided childcare grants so that they can continue this work in spite of, to the best of our ability, through the pandemic. It means that during the rallies that happened in Georgia and during the actions that were happening in 2020, that we were able to work with Black vendors, frankly, to provide as many masks, KN95 when we can afford it, because we were like, our people, all our folks in the street deserve the best, so that people can still be out there, right, and express their hurt and their anguish and their pain and their frustration with the murder of George Floyd, and be as safe as possible during a pandemic, right? So I think looking at our community as a holistically, and again, not only about, yes, we want you to vote, and also we see you and we see where you are, because as trusted messengers and as people of the community, we're having the same frustration, right? Targeting our young folks so that we can make sure that they can easily get the information that they need to vote, while also kind of sustaining to the best of our ability, the women of color and leaders of color who are holding and juggling so many responsibilities while committing lifelong to freedom through the ballot.
Yeah. So for those watching, if y'all have any questions, I'm gonna start taking questions from the audience now. So if you have any, please drop them in the chat or in the Q&A and I will look. So the one question I see is, I believe, so it's post SB 202. And Ms. Helen, you had brought this up about absentee ballot. The question is, are you seeing increased rejection rates for mail-in ballots? So for example, we've seen recent reports in Texas about the high rejection rate after their anti-voting bill passed last year. But so I guess, Ms. Helen, can you talk to us about what's going on with vote by mail in Georgia and the impact that SB 202 is having on mail ballots?
Well, if you look at the municipal elections where the implementation of SB 202 first occurred with the municipal elections that just happened in November, there was an analysis of the absentee ballot applications themselves. Now, 52% of those absentee ballot applications that were submitted were rejected due to missing the deadline or not having the proper documentation. So again, that 11 days before election day, if you submitted your absentee ballot application after that period of time, you didn't get it at all. So you weren't able to get that absentee ballot. So then if you didn't have the proper ID, you didn't submit your ID, they were rejected. You were sent a notification, but did you get the notification in time to cure that ballot? All of that kind of thing. So, and again, that's another part of the process that we need to be involved in, is we cure, as a part of our election protection work, we try to cure as many of those problems as we can. Therefore, we're saying vote early, vote early, vote early, which is 21 days prior to election day. Vote early, vote early. So if there are problems, you can get it cured. Those are the kinds of things with the absentee ballot that was there. And if you look at the mail, a lot of people didn't get their ballots, even though they got requested them in time to return them, because the mail, if you're in Albany or Savannah, your mail goes to Florida first and then comes back to Georgia. So there are barriers to that we have to be aware of and make sure that we do other methods like fax, email, and then the email, you got to know how to upload the copies, you got to sign it, and then you got to upload it again. So it's a critical process of knowing how to do that. And therefore, young people, we need you to volunteer or work with us to do that.
Yeah. So long story short, yes, there was a significant impact on vote by mail, which is just another testament as to why voter education this year is just going to be, it's going to be everything. And like Ms. Helen and Tamieka has said, we got to get creative and we got to meet every voter where they're at to do this deep education work. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. And so I want to, as we start wrapping up, I just, if there, how do you all, so let me say that this is going to be a hard year, right? There's a lot of work to do. But in the spirit of what Dr. Crawford said, this is something that Black women and the people, we have always lived in this struggle. So I'm wondering if each of you can go over and say, when times are rough and you're tired, what do you do for yourself to give you joy and love on yourself and take care of you? Because I get asked that question a lot. Hilary, how do you do it? I'm tired. What should I do? So I'm just wondering if y'all have any recommendations on self-care and what you do when times are rough and it looks like, you know, like we might have to give up. and I don't know who wants to start, but what do you do to take care of yourself? Tamieka, I'll start with you. I'm gonna put you on the spot.
No problem. With the caveat, I should do better, right? There's a starting point there. But I think I've had to list top 3 things. One is, not everyone I think is made to work in a coalition. It's 40 strong leaders, right? And it means that sometimes we can have like lengthy processes, right? Although it's always worth it in the end. But the flip side, it means that I always have people to talk to. And so that really, when I have called Miss Helen either totally frustrated or sad, or not about work at all, frankly. And I have other people at the table that I've been able to just call and be like, blah. And so not, falling, I think, prey to this superhero myth that somehow we're going to be these individuals that fix everything or being martyrs, and not working in isolation, that I can just call people and just like, I'm struggling, I'm sad, I'm crying, I'm angry. And I think the other thing that brings me a lot of joy, it's really silly, but some really good cocoa butter or shea butter, because it makes me pause, right? I'm not very good at pausing. So if I'm actually get every square inch of my skin moisturized, I've got to stop. And it's a good mental break for me. And then I'd say the last thing are actually my kids. I have spring break with them next week, and I've had to email several people today. I'm not taking meetings next week because I enjoy being a mother. And it's still not necessarily something for me. I know that's also a trick with self-care. We got to be careful, but it does give me joy to just live through them and with them, and center them and their enthusiasm and their bright eyes for the most, amazing things, without kind of telling them to hold on, mama's working and multitasking. So.
And we have a question that came up in the chat, but I think it's, applicable to the question. So Dr. Crawford, not only what are some narratives of persistence that come to mind for you to help, to help people keep courage and keep going? And so are there any narratives that you can think of that people can, go to when they're having moments of despair? And then lastly, tell us what you do to find joy in this moment.
So I have to go back to 3 themes that I've seen throughout the history of African-American women's involvement and struggle. And 3 of them and 3 priorities have always been why people do this work and what they lean on. And first one I see is faith. When I talk to people, when I've researched history, I find that many activists and organizers and people doing this, women doing this work, are really deeply, they're deep in their faith, whether it is, going to church and traditional churches or their own spiritual practices and beliefs. But faith has been a guidepost. Faith has been a well of restoration for women that I've found. The second thing is family. We just heard Tamieka talk about getting this joy from her children and seeing her children and spending this time. That family has been very important, and not only one's biological family, but the families that we have around us. Our extended families that we create. And the third, it would be our community. And as I hear Ms. Helen talk about all the work that she's been doing over the years, I'm thinking about the communities that are formed within organizations. I think about SCLC and SCLC Women and the community within NAACP. I mean, these are organizations and organizational communities where there are networks of people interacting and being with one another. And don't let me forget to talk about National Council of Negro Women and all these different kinds of organizations where people can form friendships and links and connections. So those things come forward. And when I think about the narratives, I have to always go back again to Fannie Lou Hamer, and reading her story. There are 2 major books that have been written about her recently. And she just, insurmountable odds that she overcame. So, that I go back to her story, and there's so many. I look at a life like Constance Baker Motley, a woman who's litigating before the courts. I mean, can you imagine what it must have been like to be a Black woman when you read her biography going into these Southern courts, and you didn't even have a place where you could go get lunch. And that kind of thing. So there's just so many of these narratives. And I have to say, what brings me joy, I guess I'd say teaching. When I working with young people, and I get great joy out of that, and sharing the history and learning from young people, and having conversations. I particularly like first-year college students, because they're at a time in their lives where, they're still open to, new information. And it's just such a pivotal time, if I can remember my early 20s. So I get joy from them, and I get joy from my family, being with my 90-year-old mother, and doing for her and having her be here. So that's what I'd say.
Oh, let's say, I was a middle school teacher before I got into this work, and it was just working with the kids always gives me a spark of joy. So Ms. Helen, how do you take care of yourself, Ms. Helen? And just so y'all know, I ask Ms. Helen this question once a week. So I'm going to ask you just in front of folks today.
Disclaimer, as Tamieka said, I don't always do that, but I try. Let me say, and I guess I do get relief in a different way. Sometimes when I'm really, really tired, I just like to be by myself with nothing, listen to music, even watch stupid TV shows that have no meaning, just to detox myself. And then my family, I enjoy my family a lot. I have nieces and nephews. I don't have children of my own, so I got nieces and nephews that I love to be with or talk to or be involved with them. But again, it's community, and I have so many communities that I interface with. My sororities, I was a charter member of Zeta Psi Delta Sigma Theta UGA, so the grade 8, we get together every once in a while, we communicate, we text, chat, those kinds of things. It's just, really, if I get really, really tired, that is, those are some of my outlets for being able to really take care of me. But it takes a lot for me to get to that, because I'm always on the go. But what really helps me a lot too is when I travel the state, I meet so many people that really, while I'm working, but it gives me joy and it gives me an outlet to understand other people. I de-stress sometimes, but it's a way of connecting with my community. And I think that's what I try to do.
Thank you. So for those listening, listen, this work is hard for all of us, but when we fight, we win. And sometimes fighting means, we've got to do the education, and we got to reach out, and we got to meet people where they're at. But then sometimes we have to, spend time with the kids, spend times with the nieces, spend time with our elders and our parents, and reconnecting. And so when we wrap up, this year is going to be hard. It's going to be a lot. But it's nothing we have not seen before, and it's nothing that our ancestors have not seen before. And I really think that if we stick together and keep working together, and especially with Black women leading most of the way, we're going to make it happen. And we're going to protect democracy so we can ensure that, people have equitable access to housing and reproductive justice, and anyone who identifies, LGBTQ can live with dignity. Our students can learn a truthful education. I truly believe that all that is in our grasp. And I just think that if we keep working together, and we're going to make it, y'all. So I just want to say thank you, Ms. Helen, Dr. Crawford, Tamika Atkins, and just all the work that you do. You three inspire me. I'm so thankful for you all. And thank you again to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. I actually started as an intern there. So thank you all, not just for hosting us today, but also giving me a place to start when I was just 20 years old. I appreciate everyone and have a wonderful day outside. It's beautiful. Go outside. It's beautiful out.
Thank
And
you.
thanks for
Yeah,
having us, y'all.
Thank you, Hilary.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Hilary. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.